Welcome, everybody, to another edition of No Labels Talks. Want to wish everybody a happy holiday as they prepare to head home or to wherever it is they're going to spend time with their friends and family this season. And we're here with the second part of our tariff discussion. You previously heard me talk to Scott Lincecum from the Cato Institute, who is making the case against the proposed tariffs from President-elect Trump. Now we're going to talk to Rana Faroohar from Financial Times, who is more constructive to those tariffs and thinks they actually can be a useful and necessary tool as the United States confronts some really significant trade imbalances and vulnerabilities in our supply chain. So enjoy our talk with Rana Faroohar from Financial Times. Hello, this is Ryan Clancy here for another episode of No Labels Talks. And we are accompanied today by Rana Faroohar from the Financial Times. Rana, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So Rana, let me give you a little background on our guest here. Rana has been with Time, with Newsweek, writing about economics issues. She's currently with the Financial Times as an associate editor. We are talking about tariffs this week. We actually were talking yesterday to Scott Lincecum from the Cato Institute, who was making a pretty rigorous case against the potential tariffs that President-elect Trump is thinking about implementing. You've been a little more constructive towards those tariffs, and that's why we have you on to talk today. But look, as we talked about yesterday, current U.S. tariffs, which is just basically a sales tax on things coming into the country, are an average of about 2%. President-elect Trump is talking about taking it up to 10. And then, of course, potentially 25 for things from Canada and Mexico, even higher for China. What, in your view, Rana, is the justification for doing this?
Well, let me start by your characterization of tariffs as a sales tax. It's true, but it's also interesting because it kind of implicitly shifts the conversation in a certain way, and it shifts it to the consumer as the end-all and be-all within the U.S. economy. And to be fair, that has certainly been the case for the last 40 years. That when the Reagan-Thatcher revolution happened, we stopped worrying about workers and we simply started worrying about shareholder value, which means as long as share prices are going up and consumer prices are going down, nothing else matters. Take, ship manufacturing where it's cheapest, import cheap products. You'll get cheap stuff in Walmart. That'll make up for the fact that we're going to lose a certain amount of jobs in the Rust Belt and the incomes in the manufacturing sector will be dampened. That's what happened. Unfortunately, that had big political implications. And that's why, to my mind, one of the key reasons Trump is even in office, because that shareholder value thesis was adopted by both sides of the political aisle. You can hear Larry Summers saying things today about how we still need cheap stuff and tariffs are a sales tax. Fine, except for the fact that for the last 40 years, American tariffs have been falling to historically low rates, which, as you say, are 2%. We have done nothing, unlike other countries, not just developing countries, but rich countries like Germany, for example, or France, to protect certain strategic assets in strategic industries like parts of the manufacturing sector. So I know that's long-winded, but I think it's a really important context to set. If we're worried about being able to produce our own PPE, if we're worried about being able to produce antibiotics, if we're worried about not letting China have the entire industrial manufacturing supply chain, if we're worried about being able to make ships and chips, then tariffs are something you have to consider. That said, I think that they need to be deployed very strategically, almost surgically, as just one tool in the economic toolbox. And what I do worry about is that the Trump administration has been all over the map in terms of saying how they want them to be used. Sometimes it's blanket tariffs on adversaries and allies alike. Sometimes it's, X percentage rate on China. Sometimes that changes. But that also underscores something else. And I'll kind of circle back to where I began. I think that the big thing people need to understand about economics in Trump world is that the US consumer market is no longer something that companies and countries will get that free access to, and free meaning 2%, which is almost free. They're going to have to pay for it. And that how they pay for it is going to depend on what else Donald Trump wants. Does he want Europe to spend more on their own defense? Well, then German automakers may see tariff hits. Does he want China to not invade Taiwan? You may see a trade war with China. I could go on, but think about the US consumer market as the biggest chip on the global economic poker table.
So, we have heard some shifting justifications from President-elect, as well as people around him, about the justification for tariffs. You've heard some people say, well, look, this could be a revenue raiser. We could bring
Yeah.
a lot of money, which could offset the cost of some other things they want to do, like extending the tax cuts. We've heard, as you just described, hey, this is a tactic to help protect key U.S. industries, whether
Yeah.
they're supply chains that we think we need to have here at home, whether it's military or other critical technology. In other cases, we've heard it described as, look, this is just a negotiating tactic. So
Right.
if we want China to be less aggressive on the world stage, if we want Mexico to be more aggressive in interdicting illegal migrants or fentanyl coming into our country, we can use tariffs. But it can't be all those things at once, because some of those
Right.
things
That's right.
are kind of working at cross purposes. So when you think about the incoming administration, what is it that you think is their chief justification for raising tariffs from, again, as we talked about, a baseline of about 2% to at least an average of 10% across the
Yeah.
board?
So I think there's two reasons, and in some ways, they reflect the two parts of the Trump coalition, which is the MAGA part, and there within MAGA, in particular, the part that overlaps with the far right and would like to see industrial strategy, or sorry, that overlaps with the far left and would like to see industrial strategy at home. So when I say MAGA, I'm not talking about, anti-woke, red state politics. I'm talking about we want to bring certain areas of manufacturing back to America. There's that category, and then there's the Wall Streeters and the people that simply wanted to get Trump into the White House because they think he's going to protect the market. Those people and that part of the coalition said the word tariff because it plays well in swing states. And I'll say I thought I had this. I mean, as somebody that is generally associated with the Democratic Party, I had kind of a terrible deja vu moment in the very first debate that Trump and Trump and Joe Biden did. Sorry, let me say that part again. It's the holidays. I'm oversubscribed and very tired. That in the debate that Trump did with Kamala Harris, she did something that was like just a strategic error, a self-induced strategic error, which is when she was asked about the Trump tariffs, she called them a sales tax. In Pennsylvania, that doesn't play as, oh, I'm going to save you money. That plays as, oh, you're just like the Clintons and the Obamas. You're going to send our jobs abroad. So the reason that the self-interested part of the Trump party used the word tariffs is that they wanted to get him elected. Now, there is another part. Jameson Greer, who's the new incoming USTR, would be part of this group. Bob Lighthizer, who I believe will still, even though he doesn't have a cabinet post, will play a advisory role. Peter Navarro, who's an advisor in the White House. These folks really do want to bring back manufacturing. They really do think we're in an existential crisis with China, and that at some point it will matter that we have, say, 185 ocean-going vessels and China has 5,500. At some point it will matter that 92% of all high-end semiconductors have been made in Taiwan. That's why we need manufacturing back. So those are the two camps, and consumers and workers are a little bit in the middle, waiting to see what's going to happen.
I want to ask you, one of the things that when we talked to Scott Lincecum said, so if we all agree, and I think most people do, that look, there are certain countries we trade with, China's a great example, that they're abusing and or breaking the rules. Stealing
Yeah.
our intellectual property, they're dumping low-cost subsidized goods here in the country. But what Scott would say is tariffs aren't a particularly effective tool for changing that behavior, because what happens is they'll find workarounds. So if China can't send stuff to us, they'll route it through Vietnam and it'll get assembled in Vietnam and it'll still come here. Do you think tariffs can be an effective instrument
Yeah. So
to change
again,
behavior?
I think yes, but they're one part of an overall industrial strategy. Let me speak to some of the particulars you just mentioned. Vietnam, by the way, is currently oversubscribed for manufacturing, because the minute that Trump 1 happened, as many US companies as possible shifted some production from China to Vietnam. Vietnam's a small country. You can't make anything more there. You can't make it be China. Then the rest of the Asian countries started gaining jobs. Then Mexico, we started to see reshoring. Then Eastern Europe started to benefit. India has benefited, even parts of the US, some of the, made in America supply chains in Southern California, the Carolinas have benefited. This is, in my mind, actually already making a difference, because it's increasing resiliency. The way that I think about what we want in the overall global paradigm is resiliency. I would like to see, let's say, what my friend Barry Lynn, who runs the Open Markets Institute, calls a rule of 4, where if you have a very important good, let's say semiconductors, you don't keep 92% of them in the most geopolitically contentious place in the world, aside from Gaza or Ukraine. You keep them in multiple locations, so that if there's a tsunami, if there's a war, if there's a climate change event, your eggs are not all in one basket. That's just common sense. And that's where we should be. Unfortunately, the politics of and the sort of economic models of the Bretton Woods system, the WTO, the global financial markets, they don't account for that. They just let capital, goods, and people go where it's cheapest. Capital can do that quickly. Goods can do that less quickly. People can't do it at all. So you end up with this very bifurcated system where you get a lot of cheap stuff and you get a lot of capital going into places with cheap labor, but you don't get incomes rising in rich countries. Populism is the result. So in my mind, tariffs are simply a way to start nudging, as is all economic policy, a way to start nudging things towards more of a balance. Now, in order to make that ultimately successful, you need industrial strategy at home. That's what the Biden administration tried, I think, but quite correctly to do. I'm not sure where Trump is going to go on that.
When you look at our supply chains today, where do you think we have the biggest vulnerabilities? Because we all recall during COVID, we of course had these major shortages of personal protective gear and certain medicines that were just, either manufactured in China or India and elsewhere. But if you were advising the incoming administration on, hey, these are the places where you better make sure we get some more domestic capacity to produce these things we need, where would you be focused?
Well, I would tell them to read the Biden administration's 100-day supply chain report, which was completely spot on. It was semiconductors, lithium batteries, critical pharmaceuticals and biotech, and certain kinds of clean tech, particularly things in some of those sectors that have defense and dual use overlap. I think we've done that work. The Biden administration did the work of tracking what was important and what we need to bring back. In fact, the Commerce Department even set up an entire supply chain institute where they started splicing and dicing into the details. Like, here's a good example. We think that we're going to have an AI energy crisis. We're very worried that we're not going to have enough capacity in the power grid to power AI. That's considered a sort of strategic worry, and China's going to ring fence AI. Well, actually, when the Commerce Department dug into it, they found that the real sticking point would be the amount of generators that could be produced in the US that could get things up and running if there were a cyber attack that blacked out the grid. So you got to dig in. This isn't easy stuff, and it didn't happen overnight. That's one of the reasons, frankly, I'm a little worried, because I think Trump is probably a lot better at saying 10% tariffs than he is in actually tracking out and doing the work of mapping the supply chain.
One thing the incoming president pays a lot of attention to is the trade deficit. The difference between the amount of goods we take in and the amount we send out. When I was talking to Scott Lincecum, Scott's view was that, look, that's not really a relevant measure of the health of our economy, because imports often complement then replace domestic production. So whereas when we think about our budget deficit, that's kind of, people understand why that's a bad thing. We're spending a lot more money than we're taking in. But Scott's view was we shouldn't think about the trade deficit the same way. What's your take on that?
So listen, that's very classic, neoliberal, neoclassical, depending on how you want to define it, economic theory. It works, and it's appropriate as long as you assume that we're one big happy global family. Many people in the economic community and the historical community and the financial community believe that the last 50 years was an anomaly, and that we will go back to what is a more historical norm of there being a certain amount of geopolitical contentions, and thus a need to account for resiliency in a way that classical theory it doesn't account for. Sure, I don't have to worry about trade deficits if China's just sending me money to buy T-bills and I'm assured of getting semiconductors. But if the minute that we have China saying, hey, we're going to put some barriers to certain products because we're worried about the US, not allowing us to have sovereignty in Taiwan, or we're going to start hoarding gold so that we can actually prepare for a post-dollar future, then, you're in a different universe.
Yeah.
And I'd love to see the Cato guys game that one out.
You acknowledge, of course, that tariffs are just one tool that we've got. But to the extent we have, if we're the United States and we feel like we have a trade partner who we have problems with, we have some behavior that we want to change. Let's take China, because they're both one of the biggest trading partners, and also by a lot of measures the ones who are most apt to break a lot of the rules that they supposedly agreed to when they came into the WTO. What else do we have available to change behavior other than tariffs?
It's a great question, and it's actually a question that I believe is going to come front and center, and may even be, I think this has already been released today. We're recording this Thursday. There was a bill put forward, a bipartisan bill, for a new revitalization of shipbuilding fund. So that would be, just the same way we have a highway fund or a fund to improve ports and maritime services. Both parties now believe that given that we are in a geostrategic conflict with China, we're going to want ships, and we can't build them ourselves anymore because we've outsourced that part of the industrial base. So in addition to the 301 case, which is a trade case against China that's going through, the administration may choose to support a fund to revitalize certain industries. It may choose non-tariff barriers as part of the remedies for what I think will probably be that successful 301 case against China in shipbuilding. It may set up centers of excellence. It may retrain workers. It may work with allies in some kind of partnership to reskill or to come up with shared approaches to Chinese mercantilism. There's lots of things you can do. Tariffs would be, again, just one tool in the toolbox.
One interesting thing is, for a good part of the last couple of decades, there was a bipartisan consensus that you could probably characterize as, tariffs, schmeriffs. Like people just both parties just did not think they were a good idea.
Right.
And yet what's interesting is President Trump came in, implemented some tariffs. President-elect Biden, or excuse me, President Biden kept a lot of those tariffs. And now it looks like the new administration is going to continue this focus. It sounds like you do think we're entering this era where it's going to be a more contentious environment, and this tool that was used often historically,
Yeah.
right, like is going to become a much more popular tool.
I think so. I think it will. I mean, it already has been more popular in other countries. The US has really been an anomaly in terms of dropping tariffs as low as we have across the board. That said, I think that Trump, I just don't think he's going to have a 360 industrial strategy. I think he's going to have these one-off negotiations in which tariffs will be used as a threat. You may see some kind of increased baseline on China, but I wouldn't expect to see, some sort of flat rate on Europe. I think there's also the question of inflation, and it is true that let's say here's a good example. Let's say that you raise tariffs on some sort of produce that's brought in from South America, and people suddenly see in the grocery store that prices are increasing. That has a political effect. So you have to watch and you have to make sure that the things you're raising them on don't immediately make consumers, aka workers and voters, say, gosh, I don't like that inflation is rising, because honestly, that's one of the reasons, although I don't think it was his fault policy-wise, that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris didn't get elected.
I have one last question for you before we open it up to our audience questions. And if you want to ask a question, you can just press the raise hand button and we'll call on you. Which is this: there has been some dispute, and I asked Scott about this, about who has the power as it relates to these tariffs. And historically, if you go back to the founding of the republic, it was very clear that the power was given to Congress to implement these tariffs. But over the course of the last 50 years or so, there's been several pieces of legislation in which Congress has empowered the president to do some of this unilaterally.
Yeah.
If in a month from now, Donald Trump comes in and just wants to raise tariffs from 2 to 10%, what's your view on whether he can just do that or whether he needs some kind of buy-in from Congress to make it happen?
It's an interesting question. I mean, Congress is already starting to show Trump that they may not, Republicans may not necessarily go along with him on everything. I mean, you can see that with the budgetary negotiations. I expect you are going to see a lot of wrangling, and you're going to see a lot of legal scholarship around what can and can't be done by the administration. But again, I just think that tariffs are going to be almost a day-to-day negotiation in this administration. I think that it's going to be used in ways that are very much about whatever is on Donald Trump's mind at that particular time. I have a hard time imagining right now what the drop dead, go to the mat issue would be that Trump is going to be willing to push on with Congress. Yeah, particularly in the early days.
Interesting. Okay, well, we'll be watching. Let's get to some questions, starting with Al. Al, go ahead, over to you.
Sure, Rana. My question goes to the role of advocacy. At No Labels, we have a common sense advocacy network, and you pointed to the power of the American consumer and how that is a reference point for global geopolitics. So my question is, how do we at No Labels begin to interact with that reference point, to harness that reference point as a common sense model for public policy here in America?
Such a great question. I can give you one real world example that I think is very telling. So the textile industry is an industry that, when China came into the WTO in 2001, it and furniture were probably the hardest hit and the quickest hit. Those are low margin goods. They tended to be produced in non-union places in the South. You know, jobs just went. There was nobody protecting those jobs. And now, in the last few years, there's been an outcry, a consumer outcry, and a political outcry against forced labor in Xinjiang, which is in Western China, where you see Uyghurs being, you know, forced to harvest cotton in just, you know, really abysmal circumstances. There, you know, rightfully so, there's been an outcry amongst policymakers and the public. And so now you have stipulations about the use of Xinjiang cotton in US supply chains and in certain European supply chains. That has had a real effect. And one thing that's been quite fascinating for me to track is the way in which when we decide we want to use that power, the price differential and the pain can actually be mitigated much faster than we think. And here's how. I have followed for a long time because I find textiles fascinating for all kinds of reasons. A company that does a made in America supply chain, they're called American Giant, and they started out doing soup to nuts, cotton t-shirts, sportswear, etc. Good high quality jobs, good labor and environmental standards, and the price points were expensive. I mean, they were things that hip rich kids in Brooklyn could buy, but maybe not elsewhere. They have started working with bigger and bigger suppliers over time, bringing down the cost of that $50 or $30 garment to now, this past July 4th, actually on Independence Day, they went into partnership with Walmart and did an entirely made in America t-shirt. The price point was, I believe, $12.99.
Correct.
That is only $4 difference between the cheapest polyester Xinjiang made product. And if you tallied the real cost of that labor, the real cost of that cotton, you would have parity. Now think about if we had a government that actually used its own purchasing power, perhaps at the behest of consumers that would insist that everything in their local area, in their state, in their military was made in a certain way. Think about how quickly we could make that happen.
Great. Thank you, Ron. I appreciate that.
Thanks, Rana. Phil, over to you. Phil, you are on mute.
How's that?
There we go. Gotcha.
Okay, I thought I'd unmuted you. Basically, I had originally wanted to ask you about the list of strategic materials, because I think there's a lot of things you would need that probably aren't on the list. You know, if you want to build ships, you need steel. And most of the steel we do make is actually junk cars that are melted down. Not going to be real helpful.
So it's a great question, and I would just say to you, in fact, it's interesting that you bring up steel. The folks that came up on the labor left mostly, but some folks on the right that came up with shipbuilding as an industry to target were mainly from the steel industry. And the thinking was, let's find the biggest hit here. Let's find the thing that if you did bring it back, it would support that raw material at scale, you know, in a strategic way. And you have to start somewhere. So you're right, we don't make enough steel. But if, you know, I would, there's a great book, I'm going to be an optimist. And, you know, I come from a military family, and I just believe in our ability to scale up and respond to crises when we need to. There was a great book called Freedom's Forge that looked at the World War II industrial scale up. There is nothing in that book, I believe, that would be physically impossible to do today. It's a matter of political will.
Except in 1940, you had the basic heavy industries in existence. Generally, we don't have any of that. And just squeeze in the last final part would be, we need a chemical industry as well. When we were in Afghanistan, there was a shortage of bullets on the civilian market because they couldn't get any gunpowder, let alone the rest of that.
No, you've got a point about heavy industry because you're right. I mean, a lot of what went into munitions in World War II was the government saying to Detroit, stop making cars and start making other things. I do believe that there is more capacity still than we think, and I'll tell you why I'm a little more bullish maybe than you are. That we have, and I grew up in rural Indiana. My dad ran small and mid-sized factories in the auto supply chain. There is a very robust small and mid-sized industrial market still in America. Now, I will tell you, a lot of that is being rolled up by private equity right now, which terrifies me. But I think that there is still more capacity than we can tally easily in the public markets, and that it could be harnessed in a time of crisis. But, listen, this is not to say you don't have great points, particularly on the biotech front. It's scary how much of the raw inputs we cannot make here anymore.
Bill, thank you. You get the Christmas Spirit Award. Great Christmas tree.
Yes, a great Christmas tree, but very, very depressing thought.
That's a nice contrast. He's very
Yes,
much in the holiday
exactly.
spirit, but then we can't get gunpowder and we're all screwed. I think we had one more question, I think, from Dan, although maybe we just lost Dan.
No, I'm here.
Oh, there we go, Dan. Over to you.
You lost me? I've got trees, but they're all outside, so I have to forgive me. I've still got two questions. One is continuing what Phil was talking about, but more specifically, you mentioned you can't move people, you can move manufacturing, et cetera. And what about the possibility of a snapback reaction from China on the rare earths that they really do help hold a corner in the market?
Yes, they do.
Yeah.
Yes, they do. Well, all right. I'll stay in the holiday spirit and continue to be a little optimistic. You're right that China does control about 80% of the existing rare earth supply. However, the U.S. is strangely blessed in its actual raw materials in this area. We just don't have the mining capacity because we haven't permitted in a lot of places. And that's something I kind of wonder, and I'm a little surprised that you haven't heard the whole Doge faction of the Trump administration talk more about. I mean, they've been talking about knocking out this or that department. I wish they'd start talking about regulation and because I do think, and again, I support good regulation for high standards in labor and the environment, but I also think that, we have probably gone overboard in some areas, and that there are also tough choices that need to be put clearly to the American people. So, for example, I, happen to know of a American mining company that's trying to get permitting to do a variety of rare earths, of which there are a tremendous supply, some of them close to native grounds in the West, some of them in national park areas. Now, I'm not going to take a position on, should we or shouldn't we, but that's the question. We're now in a different geopolitical environment. Do we want to make a decision that, yes, we will set aside a certain percentage of this land plot, or we will make it a little easier or faster to permit if there is a rare earth that can be gotten domestically or in Canada? I mean, these are the questions that we have to start making very clear and plain, I think.
One thing I want for those who are listening who might not be up to speed on this, I mean, this gets to this classic tension. When you talk about permitting reform, on the one hand, President Biden just spent 4 years passing all this legislation to accelerate the adoption of clean energy. On the other hand, as Rana just mentioned, a lot of these clean energy technologies require these rare earth minerals, wind turbines, car batteries, most of which are not mined here, a lot of which are mined in China. So, you'll see this tension now where you'll have some people in the Democratic coalition say, hey, we got to build this stuff. So we are going to have to do some mining here in the United States. Other people will say, oh, well, we can't do that. So
yeah, and Ryan, I'll add another thing, and I think you just made a great point. There's another part of this, which is, all right, let's say we decide, no, we're not going to dig up parts of the West or intrude on native grounds in order to do that mining. We're going to do it in China. Well, that carries its own carbon load because it'll be dirtier. It will also be transported a greater distance. Transport alone, just global logistics, is the second biggest pollution emitter, greenhouse gas emitter, next to China. So then the question becomes, how do we think about mining in the Rockies now? What do we, so it's an equation that I think, one of the things I like about this debate is that we're at least now having it clearly.
Yeah, Rana, just to follow on that, by the way, it's been a pleasure listening to you.
Thank you.
Just a quick question, something you brought up about the consumer driving made in America. I hate to be a cynic on that, but I was in consumer electronics in the 1980s. We tried that and it failed miserably.
Oh boy, yeah. Yeah, yeah. Well, all right. So I have a question, I guess, for you. You're in consumer electronics. That's a commoditized, that was, became a commoditized
Mhm.
business. And it was a business in which people didn't really understand the origins as well as they might have. I mean, I remember, you remember when the Intel Inside campaign
Oh,
started?
yeah.
That, that was a brand that said, we want you to know who we are. We used to be a chip, we used to be anonymous. Now we want you to know who we are. Do you think if we had a greater understanding of what was actually in something, that it would matter?
Well, I mean, again, I was with the General Electric company at the time. We put a full court press on that exact point.
Interesting.
To our dealer network, to the consumer, to everybody, and everybody said,
Mhm.
well, it's cheaper over here, and it's the
It's
same.
cheaper
And as you
over here.
point out, it
Yeah.
was perceived as a commodity. But anyway, like I said, I don't want to be a cynic, and again, I really do appreciate your comments.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, your whole business this is going to be a massive question. And I do think it will be easier for Trump to put tariffs on Chinese consumer electronic component goods than it would be for him to stick tariffs on, say, a Louis Vuitton handbag. I mean, I do think it starts to matter on the flip side, in ways that could actually benefit domestic producers. But anyway, we'll leave it so we can have more questions.
Yeah,
I'd love to
great
have a
point.
longer
Thank you.
conversation with you.
All right, take care.
Interesting. Thanks, Dan. Mike, over to you.
Okay, so good. So in the Christmas spirit, I'll give a little bit of good news on the rare earth question. It turns out there is an awful lot of rare earth materials in coal ash ponds, of which we have tons around the country.
That's
Great.
interesting. Didn't know that.
That's wonderful.
There you go. Merry Christmas.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate that. Wow, he just calls in to give us good tidings. Appreciate that.
I have to think of
Um,
something like a gift to give before I leave. Oh my goodness.
Mary, you have a question.
Yes, thank you. I'm wondering if tariffs are a solution to the problem that voters want us to solve. I'm influenced, Rana, by your book, Makers and Takers, and how financialization's created stunning income inequality in this country. In the 1920s, the top 1% of US families got 24% of all US income. That fell to about 9% in the 1970s, and now it's back up to almost 30%. I believe that's what voters are mad about. In the 1920s, we tried tariffs and kicking out immigrants. Does that sound familiar? But we didn't fix financialization, and then we ended up with a 1929 crash and a Great Recession. So I'm wondering if tariffs get us anywhere.
Well, Mary, first of all, you're a very sharp reader. And I think you've raised the larger question of paradigm shift. And because everything you're talking about, financialization, inequality, the trade paradigm, they're all connected. And the way that I look at things is I probably wouldn't even have had, although it's hard in the context of 45 minutes to say, let's talk about the entire political economy and figure it out. So tariffs are a nice way to sort of, wrap 45 minutes together. But the truth of the matter is, if you want to change things, you have to talk about, well, who do we care about in society? Just consumers? If we just care about consumers, then what we have is working okay. We've gotten cheaper stuff and stock prices have gone up. But if we care about workers, then we need to rethink the paradigm. If we care about communities and their cohesiveness, and we don't want to hollow out large parts of the middle American, heartland and end up with deaths of despair, then we need to care about different things. And so everything you've raised, which actually hit the sort of triumvirate of my book. My first book was about finance. The next book was about technology. And the third book was about globalization. They hit all those things. My feeling, just as a quick note, I know we only have about 5 minutes left. I think that these extremes, and you mentioned quite rightly the extreme of the 1920s v. today, they have a way of correcting themselves. Sometimes they do it messily, but when political pendulums shift too far in one direction, which I would say that ours has, they swing back in the other direction. So we have gotten very unequal, very financialized, very offshored, very globalized. If you think about kind of what's going to happen, I think we're going to become less financialized. I sadly think there will be a market crash at some point that will correct that. I see a lot of older people. I hope folks are in, a certain amount of T-bills and cash. Talk more about that on another podcast if you want, or listen to me on January 2nd. I'm going to be on Point Radio talking about this on NPR. We're going to see a little bit of global deglobalization and regionalization as we think more about resiliency. And I believe, and this is a larger political point, I believe that not for this 4 years, but ultimately the party that is able to position itself best for working people will succeed. I think that we have ended the era in which we can continue to just make stock prices go high and not worry about what people are making in their paycheck and whether they can afford housing or healthcare or education. And I would just look at hundreds of years of economic history as you see that pendulum shift back and forth.
Rana,
I just pray we can get there without a market, a 1929 crash and a Great Depression.
I hope that too, but I got to tell you, and I say this seriously, I'm going partially to cash this year because I do think that corrections happen. A correction will happen. I don't know when, but it will.
I agree.
Rana just gave you all some free financial planning advice.
I didn't mean to do that, but I'm like thinking about my husband's 70, I'm 54. I could maybe weather it, but he's like, I'm going a little bit to cash.
Final question to Mark. Mark, go
Yeah,
ahead.
I'm 70 today. So
Congratulations.
Happy birthday.
geez, thanks. And I look great too, right?
You do.
I just wanted to bring up another example of where we've lost another capability. I'm in the nuclear industry, and we wanted to build a plant a few years back. There's not a single forge in the United States that was big enough to build a reactor vessel. So we had to go to Japan to have it built and then ship it to Spain to have it worked.
Wow. And nuclear could be such an important part of the environmental solution if we wanted it
for
to
sure. Yes, definitely.
be.
I'm hopeful though. I'm working on a different one now, smaller. Maybe the forge will be big enough for the smaller
Rana,
one.
it's interesting. This being the holidays, I do want to end on a hopeful note by going back to something you said earlier, which is if you look at the United States historically, when we have some in the political will to decide we want to build things, then we build the Empire State Building in a year and a half, and we crank out, a couple ships a month during World War II. And so we can do it, but we just have to decide we want to, right?
I think that's 100% true. And here's a little Christmas gift I can give. I do think I travel quite a lot, and I was just in Europe actually a couple of weeks ago at a conference with a bunch of French intellectuals right when the French government fell. And I have to say I was a little dispirited by the kind of like, lack of can-do, lack of vision, lack of energy about the future that you often feel when you're in these circles in Europe. we may be polarized to a certain extent in this country, but I do come back here and I feel a sense of can do. I see it in my children. I see it in younger people. I see it, frankly, in older people. I mean, we are quite singular in this economy, in people continuing to work into, there's my husband's show, he's upstairs writing his 18th book. He's not stopping anytime soon. I just think we are a can-do nation that accounts for the fact that our trend growth continues to be about a percentage point above Europe. And it's a good thing. We got a lot of problems, but we also have a lot of fighting spirit.
There we go. That is a great note to end on. Rana, thank you so much during this busy holiday season for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me. And sorry about all the scheduling back and forth, but Merry Christmas to all. And thank you for reading and thank you for listening.
Likewise. And thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back after the holiday and into the new year for the next episode of No Labels Talks. In the meantime, everybody have a wonderful holiday season.